One of the things that will happen, usually on about the first story or two I get, is I'll get people who will write stories, and they will end up saying, a student said. Well, a student said, what student? I mean, give me the name. We don't allow anonymous sources. The basic premise of this is, if somebody's going to be given our space in our newspaper or our magazine or our, online site or TV show or radio program, whatever it be, if we're going to give them space to say their opinion, then they need to stand behind it, because otherwise, it kind of gives them just freedom to say whatever they want without any repercussions. But if you have to say it and you have to deal with the repercussions and people see what you said, then suddenly you're going to be, I'll say more polite, but also I'll say more accurate. Because I think the case is that things like, you go to online forums or other things, and if, they're connected to some sort of social media or other things, I think people tend to be a little more polite than if it's completely completely anonymous. So what we say is, sources should always be named. Now, with that said, there's always an exception. For example, Watergate would never have been broken if they had not agreed to take that information, basically, as an anonymous source. But the case is that while it was an anonymous source, the editor knew who Deep Throat was. Deep Throat was this was a source that gave the information that brought down the Nixon administration. But the thing is their editor, Ben Bradley, did know who Deep Throat was. He knew exactly who Deep Throat was, and he was, he trusted that what this person was saying was accurate. So the case is that if somebody ever requests anonymity or says I'd rather not use their name, I would just move on. Unless they have some information that might be really big, or they might have a legitimate reason to speak on basically without giving their name. Cases are where it's highly sensitive, maybe cases of, domestic issues where they might lose their job. When I say domestic issues, like rape or child abuse or other things, and they just kind of don't want their name out there, I think an editor would consider it. But the case is that anytime you do that, you still need to know who the person is, and you need to check it out. There's an old saying in journalism that if your mother says she loves you, check it out. That the idea is we don't believe anything from anybody. And people who are going to be anonymous sources, that really questions their credibility. But we might allow them to speak that way if it is something fairly significant, something that we think has a legitimate point. I'll give you a couple of examples. Last semester I had a student who did a story about Brittany Maynard, the woman who moved to Oregon in order to commit suicide under the physician-assisted suicide laws there, that they'll prescribe medication and help you commit suicide if you have a terminal case. And he did a story in which he talked to some people at the area hospices and local hospitals and asked them some questions. And a few of them said that they would do what they could, but they also worked for St. John's. And so he just simply talked to them as, nurses at St. John's. And I thought that was a fair enough case, because the reality is that there was a man named David Gill who's an emergency room physician, and he ran for Congress a couple times, and he actually got fired because he advocated for physician-assisted suicide. And especially at a Catholic hospital, if you were to suggest that you might help or assist in some way in a physician-assisted suicide, that could very easily get you terminated. And so that would be a case where an editor might do it. But the case is that's not really a reporter's decision, that's an editor's decision. You should still say, here's the deal. I won't use your name, but I still need your name in order to talk to my editor about it. My editor may call you. He may want to interview you himself or herself, but the case is that I can't just say no. Now, there are a few other cases, such as in politics, sometimes there's a category we call background. And background is basically this idea that, that when I say background, what it means is instead of naming the source, it'll say something like, a person with knowledge of the case, or a White House employee or a White House insider with knowledge of what's upcoming, or a congressional insider, all kinds of things. But what it is background means that you're allowed to use some basic information about who they are, but you're not allowed to name them. Now, background has to be general enough that it could be multiple people, and so it essentially alleviates it, but it also gives their position as a way to bolster what they are. So you might say, if somebody here at Lincoln Land gave us some key information about some issue, we could say, Lincoln Land employee who works in the area, who does this. If you get too specific, like a Lincoln Land employee in student life who works, blah, blah, blah. Well, there's only two full-time employees in student life. That would be pretty well giving it away, And so the case is, there might be, in the student life office, that there's only two. There are a lot of part-time student workers, but that's all there are. So the case is that, you kind of have to be general enough, but yet also give some background. That's permitted in certain cases where, for example, I would say the people that we used in that story about Brittany Maynard were actually on background, because we said a hospice nurse with St. John's or something like that. And that would give enough cover. But the other thing is in politics, sometimes that's a more accepted practice. It's actually kind of a White House move that says, where they'll say, have one of your people leak this out to the press, and let's see what the reaction is. And so they'll say something, and then suddenly the Republicans will scream, or the Democrats will scream, and the public outrage will be like, are they kidding me? And suddenly, people are coming together, or it gets leaked out that the president's about to take action on some issue in a certain way, and suddenly the opposition party, the Democrats, the Republicans, are over there willing to negotiate because they're not happy with the action the president's going to take on the issue, and so they'd rather reach a compromise. Because once the president takes action, they may have no more say. Those would all be cases of sort of a typical fashion, and if you were in one of those roles, which would probably take several years to get into one of those roles. But if you were in one of those roles, you would be using that type of information more. But for the majority of reporters, you don't deal with that on a regular basis. Which brings us to the other case of off-the-record information. Sometimes people will come along and they'll say, they'll say, oh, I'll tell you something off the record. Well, every reporter needs to make a choice whether or not they're willing to hear information off the record. The reason I say that is you're all mostly young, but I can tell you, I'm closing in on 40 very quickly, and I can tell you that, sometimes my mind's not quite as sharp as it used to be. I'm not saying it's dull or anything. I'm just saying that it's just, sometimes things are just a little less precise, and my thoughts are just not quite as put together as they used to be. Not that they were horribly put together before, but the case is at some point when you begin to get information off the record, sometimes you forget what's off the record, and you begin to think maybe I'll accidentally put it in, or I'll accidentally reference it to somebody, or other things. And so one thing to keep in mind as you do that is you have to be careful to make sure you can distinguish. Now, I'm sure if I was told something off the record, I could still distinguish. I was kind of joking about that. But the case is that you need to be aware, it is easy to confuse those things and go, is it off the record or is it not? As an example of this, what typically would happen is if you were in an interview and somebody said this is off the record, usually you would stop the recorder and you would put down your pencil and, completely put it on the table. Don't even have it in your hand and just not be writing. Just completely set it down and say, oh, okay. Stop the recorder and say, what is it? And they tell you, and then as soon as you feel like the off-the-record information is done, if you guys are talking and you feel like maybe you're back on the record, you should just stop and say, hey, are we off the record still, or are we on the record? And if they say, no, we're back on the record, then you restart the recorder. But making sure to stop it is something you need to do to be able to assure them that you're actually abiding by their wishes. Sometimes people say, well, what if I didn't? What if I heard it, remembered it, went home, wrote it down, and published it? I said, well, the problem with that is you're a journalist. Journalists cover a lot of stuff. They cover science, medicine, they cover social events, they cover politics, they cover the courts. And the reality is your skill is the ability to listen, gather information, and accurately portray it. If you are taking information and not using it accurately, you're going to screw yourself over. People aren't going to trust you. They're going to say, I told him that on background, or I told him that off the record, and he still used it, she still used it. And you're going to end up shooting yourself in the foot. And so the answer is yeah, you could use it, but you're going to lose your professional reputation. And if your boss finds out you've been doing that, you're probably going to get fired, because the only thing really journalists have is their ability to write, their ability to gather, their ability to get information, and their ethics. And their ethics is key. People sometimes think reporters and people in the media are unethical, but I would argue that reporters and media people are more ethical than a lot of people, because they realize if they can't be trusted by their sources, then they're not going to be in this business very long. That they need to be able to be trusted. So that would be my one thing to say. The thing is people say the other option is just not to listen to it because you don't want to be confused. And I know people who are like that. Somebody says, oh, let me tell you this off the record. They say, no, I don't want to hear anything off the record. That way there's never any confusion about the matter. That's fine. I understand that. My only thing is when I was working, I didn't mind getting some information off the record, because sometimes I would hear it and then I would be able to convince them to let me use it. I would say, well, what can I use? Can I use this? Can I use that? Just an example, one of the few cases of where I got off the record information, which is completely just a superficial issue, especially now. But I had done a story, I was doing a story about a high school that a lot of times bands and stuff will sell grapefruit and oranges around in winter, and they'll sell them by the case as a fundraiser for their band. And so this one band group was selling grapefruit and oranges by the case, and they had basically there was a problem with the fact that the citrus industry had a record cold year, and they had some problems with their crop, and they didn't have enough produce to provide. And so as a result of this condition, they didn't have enough produce, and so they were having to push up the prices in order to, just it's a matter of supply and demand. And so the cases, they pushed up, they were short on, and so the price had gone up quite significantly. So instead of a case of oranges costing, say, $15-20, they were going to cost $40 or $35. I mean, it was a pretty significant, like 66% increase. I don't know what these things would cost now, but I mean, it'd be like $30, I'm guessing, versus like $45 or $50. And so, pretty big push. And people who came through and have bought a case every year, were going to be shocked by the fact, and they were worried about this because they weren't going to make any more money off of it, but they were going to be forced to try to sell a product that they kind of depended upon, and they didn't, was going to be quite, outpricing the market. And so he told me this, and I said, okay, and, we talked, and I was back on the record. And then later the next day I thought, it would be really good if I could get something in there about the prices going up. And the conversation had been off the record. So I called the guy back up, and I said, I know you told me this off the record, what the prices were going to be. I didn't know if there was any way I could use it. I said, I hate to, push it, but I really feel like that would really help the story. And he said, no, I really don't want you to use it, because I think it'll go better if our salespeople, our students are able to go out and talk to the people who've bought in the past and explain to them why it's so expensive. That will actually have better luck. I said, okay, I understand that. I said, but here's the thing. I would like to be able to say something about the prices that maybe we could, just to give it some sort of perspective. I said, would it be possible for me to maybe give a percentage, like me saying, the prices may going up as much as 66% on a case of oranges. And he said, yeah, that would be fine. And so we agreed to that, and I used that, and it worked. So that would be the one case where I say off the record is something that, is okay to take once in a while as a way to get it back on. But it kind of is just your opinion about whether or not you want to hear it or not. Off the record is obviously information that could be less reliable because they don't have to stand behind it and they're going to deny it. But it is something to consider.